welcome to UNISA's Graduate School of Business Leadership Thought Leaders series. I'm Karima Brown. In March this year, the South African government released a report on the future of state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. And of course, the 215-page document sets out short, medium, and long-term plans for just how the various recommendations listed in the document will be shaping the new landscape of SOEs and state-owned companies. Joining me in this special edition of CNBC Africa, we are bringing to you the Minister for State-Owned Enterprises, Mr. Malusi Gigaba, who's been a key driver of this process. The proceedings tonight will also be joined later in the second hour of the program, or rather the second half of the program, by a series of pertinent and questions raised by the members of our audience, which will be made up from the alumni of the business school and, of course, very key stakeholders in the state-owned companies areas. Minister, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Now, of course, everybody knows that the process of reviewing state-owned companies and entities has been a very long process. It comes off the back of a series of initiatives already initiated by the government. And then, of course, a set of recommendations has come up, one of which is to marry both the developmental challenges that these entities are supposed to address together with issues around efficiency and efficacy and, of course, long-term profitability and sustainability. Minister, from where you're sitting, are you happy that the review process has managed to meet those twin objectives?
That actually is the fundamental reason why state-owned companies exist. Because state-owned companies don't exist for their own sake, for the mere fact that they've been established. They exist to satisfy a particular developmental objective as outlined in the policy framework of the existing government. As a result, state-owned companies are in a unique situation where they must both be commercially viable and be efficient, and at the same time they must fulfill certain developmental objectives as outlined in your National Development Plan, in various policy documents, the New Growth Path, and others. To that extent, if the commercial interest supersedes the developmental objective, the purpose for the existence of that particular state-owned company would have been nullified.
Right.
But at the same time, if the overriding concern is the developmental objective without addressing issues of commercial viability and sustainability, the company would not be able to fulfill the developmental objective. So in how we view the state-owned companies and how we judge their performance, we need to bear this in mind. Their purpose is not really to address the bottom line and provide a profit and dividend to the state. They have a cross-cutting function which makes state-owned companies to be a bit more complex to run.
Let's target that complexity, Minister. Some people will argue that it is not often able to meet both objectives of sustainability in terms of developmental needs as well as profitability. Let's take SAA for example. Many airlines, let's say Argentina for example, the last ambassador who was there, Mr. Tony Leon, wrote a piece in the Business Day recently arguing that the state carrier there runs a loss of $1 million a day, but it gets kept going because it has developmental objectives. How do you marry developmental objectives when it appears as if those objectives is equated with throwing money down a black hole, where you don't get profitability, where you don't actually get a dividend that gives an impression that we are making progress as far as the profitability of these businesses are concerned?
Let me start with saying the private companies wrecked the global economy. Trillions of dollars were pumped into them.
So you reckon they're not poster boys for efficiency?
Nobody is complaining about it. In actual fact, there is a demand that governments must pump more money to sustain those companies. And yet, their developmental objectives are limited, extremely limited. on the other hand, state-owned companies which were not responsible for the global crisis, with developmental objectives, when they need support in order to sustain their programs, then there is an argument that that money is being wasted. If you look at SAA, the contribution it is making not only in the economy through bringing customers, ensuring tourists and other visitors to our country, ensuring that they are able to spend their money in the country, taking South African business people abroad. When we are in the far-flung corner, away from the major global markets, if you consider the fact that the airline sustains about 11,000 jobs, it trained about 3,000 young people in various aircraft maintenance-related skills. It partners with FET colleges and trains young people as pilots, and thereby contributes towards changing the demographic composition of the pilot community in South Africa. You therefore, when you look at all of those things, must consider that state-owned companies do play their role and do need support from government, in as much as the private sector demands that support from various governments. The IMF, the European banks and others have been pumping trillions of dollars and euro into supporting the private sector, and the beneficiaries actually walk away. The global crisis has created a situation whereby the people who created it are walking away with profits.
Minister, I think that everybody will agree with you on those points, but there is a case to be made for the fact that, given the fact that one operates a company as a state-owned company, can't mean no accountability. It can't mean disrespect for the bottom line. There has to be, particularly governments who have limited funds to do a series of things, there has to be a healthy respect for financial prudence. From as long as you've been in this portfolio, if we take SAA, has there been that respect shown for that bottom line? Has there been the respect shown that the South African public's purse cannot continue to fund an airline that flounders from one financial crisis to the next?
Let's take the portfolio in totality. You have seen drastic improvements in Transnet. The company was loss-making, in difficulty a few years ago. It's able now to not only post positive results, but it has driven an investment of 307 billion rand into this economy. In the last financial year, they invested 27.5 billion rand, which was unprecedented in the history of the company, and this increases to over 30 billion rand this financial year. You take Eskom, with the challenges of supply constraints, it continues to post positive results, therefore to be able to raise money to reinvest in the economy and build more capacity. Denel has turned around, posting positive results. Right. Alexco is going to post positive results. A number of our companies are focusing on both meeting their, respecting, as you correctly say, the commercial viability responsibility which they have, with and balancing that with the developmental objective. The issues that we are addressing at SAA, including through the recent long-term turnaround strategy, right, the changes we're envisaging in how SAA relates with SA Express and Mango, and how the organization gets structured, its route network, its strategy going forward, all are informed by this consideration that South Africans are concerned. And the beauty of it is that South Africans are concerned about having the national carrier, flying the South African flag. They want it to be successful, to be viable, because they take pride in it. And therefore, the leadership of our companies respect this. As the shareholder, that is why we play an active and activist role, hands-on, to direct what these companies are doing, because we have an understanding, not from a commercial point of view, but also from a political point of view, of the interests of South Africans as the ultimate shareholders of these companies.
Now, of course, this way in which you're characterizing government's role, an activist shareholder role, there's been a lot of debate around exactly what the nature of the relationship ought to be between shareholders and boards. And it's not always been a smooth sailing process. You've had challenges in a lot of institutions. Some people believe that there should be a healthy distinction and there should be a clear delineation of roles, that you have government as the shareholder that essentially frames policy, sets the norms and standards, that you have the board that must drive the strategy, that must do the turnaround. Sometimes those lines get blurred, Minister. What, in your view, is the ideal mix? What is that shareholder compact supposed to look like?
You know, the challenge in the past was a hands-off approach to shareholder management, where the company does as it pleases, and when it gets into trouble, the state must step in to bail it out. We have developed a framework based on the Companies Act, where we have defined our relationship with the companies. That's why the companies in our portfolio, the governance is stable.
Some people will argue whether it's stable across the board.
It's very stable. The challenges at SAA in terms of governance were addressed speedily, and that was the only one. The problem is when you take one instance and use it to generalize, to portray a general picture, when in actual fact it's a specific instance to a particular entity. So we have the shareholder compact, which is negotiated between the shareholder and the company based on the strategic intent statement, where the shareholder says, these are the things we would want as the shareholder to achieve during this financial year. Then the department and the company sit down to draft the shareholder compact, which is signed before the AGM, and that shareholder compact will inform the corporate strategy for the company for that financial year going forward. So to that extent, the relations are very well defined. Nobody interferes in another's activities, but the relationship that we have is quite healthy, very robust, and shows that we are able to focus on the work they need to do and support them whenever they need our support. And we are clued up as to the challenges that each one of our companies are facing because of this robust relationship and activist nature of our relationship.
If one looks at best practice around the world, Minister, I mean, the commission that looked at reconfiguring state-owned companies and enterprises did a broad study, and it looked at how other countries are doing it. Many people are saying that South Africa's government is quite enamored with the Chinese model, where the state plays a very dominant, very big role, and that the relationship between shareholders and boards is a very, dynamic, finely balanced one, but where you have the state looming large, not necessarily as an interfering partner, but as a very active partner, because it shapes economic development through these institutions and use them as vehicles. Is it correct to say that South Africa is enamored with the Chinese model? And if so, how is that interministerial committee looking like that has been given the responsibility to drive the process of reconfiguring in the medium to long term how state-owned companies are to be run?
In actual fact, we are developing a South African model. We've been quite impressed with the Namibian model. We've been quite impressed with the Norwegian model. We've been impressed with the Chinese model, with the Indonesian model. So, based on all of those models, we are busy developing a South African model. Our approach to state-owned companies doesn't fall in a vacuum. It doesn't come from space. It's based on the approach of this government towards the economy, the desire to establish a developmental state that plays an active role in the economy, that is able to direct economic direction and discipline the private sector if and when the need arises. So our approach to state-owned companies is informed by that broad framework of how we interact with economic agents and direct the work they do, because we have particular objectives as a country to address poverty, to create jobs, develop skills, industrialize the economy, and combat inequality. If we were to say the state must simply stay away, we would not be able to respond to this. So the model that we are developing, that the interministerial committee hasn't been established by the president yet.
Is that a presidential decision, Minister?
It's going to be a presidential decision, because ultimately the reconfiguration of the architecture of state-owned companies, including DFIs in the country, will stretch beyond, it will transcend the narrow mandate of the portfolio of the Department of Public Enterprises. It will involve state-owned companies that are in provinces, that fall under other departments. And so the president, as the person with the more overriding authority, will establish the interministerial committee, drive the process. We will report to cabinet, and cabinet will take the final decision. Thus far, as Minister Chabane has indicated, cabinet has expressed broad support for the report of the Presidential Review Commission, which means that there is going to be a reconfiguration of the architecture of state-owned companies. We now have to get into the nitty-gritty of what belongs where, and whether the Department of Public Enterprises remains in the present form or it gets recomposed. But what the Presidential Review Committee has suggested is that you do need a central organ that guides as the shareholder management functions and interests of the state.
Now, the models, as you say, have not been finalized, and that is still the process of a lot of discussion and I suppose negotiation, because you're talking about your cabinet colleagues here as well. But many of the observers who watch the public-owned company space argue that as Minister of Public Enterprises, you are certainly in pole position to play a very key leadership role in the reconfiguration and recalibration, if you like, of that architecture. Ideally, Minister, without stepping on the toes of your cabinet colleagues, what is it that you would want to be responsible for? You are currently responsible for the big 9. We've got over 700 entities. There's suggestions, for example, that Telkom, for example, comes to your portfolio. I know in the African National Congress there's been a long debate about where exactly some of these entities ought to go, whether they should go back to individual line ministry functions. And of course it's going to be a huge negotiation. But I wanted to get your personal view, or your view given the fact that you've now been in this ministry. What would you like to be in charge of in terms of this process? Would you like to hold on to the big 9? Would you like Telkom to come to you?
No, let me remove myself from the picture and let's leave the institution, Public Enterprises Department, and say, because I might be redeployed either way at any time. So let's remove the individual. That tends to cause the tensions. Now, my thought, if I were to contribute towards the debate, would be that we need to distinguish between state-owned companies, those that are infrastructure related and are commercial in their nature, state-owned entities, those that are not of necessity commercial and fulfill a more public role, and the development finance institutions. I think even the report of the Presidential Review Committee makes that suggestion, so that taking into consideration the fact that the framework of a shareholder management in the country has not yet been harnessed to a point of maturity as in China, where you would have your state-owned companies and your DFIs all in one portfolio under the SASEC, the commission. So in our case, we need to take the bite that we can chew, we can afford to chew, and move steadily. Because if we were to be too ambitious at the outset, we might find ourselves messing up a good project. Because at the end of the day, South Africa has got very good and strong state-owned companies. Those companies can be very well harnessed in favor of development to industrialize the economy. I think that the fundamental objective of the existence of these companies today must be to industrialize the economy, to create jobs and develop skills, to develop supplier sectors, and we must not mess up with that objective.
Now, this fear of not wanting to mess up can also lead to paralysis to act, because if it's not broke, don't fix it can be the answer. Yeah, and like I've said, you've said now that some of it is broken. In fact, serious weaknesses were identified in the report, both in terms of management, the lack of skills, questions around financial controls, the appropriateness of some of the people that serve on these institutions. If we were to take the short-term recommendations of the entire process, Minister, what needs to happen almost immediately to just get the state-owned companies on a footing where we can begin to say that they are now able to be used for business in a way that makes sense, both at a sustainable level, but also from a financial and a commercial level?
One of the areas that are broken is coherence. There is no coherence in how shareholder management functions are exercised, responsibilities are exercised, precisely because of this disjuncture in the architecture of these companies. So you would have the companies in our portfolio being managed differently from others. So you need this new architecture, this new framework in order to create that coherence. You need, as the PRC suggests, a shareholder governance legislation, which is going to spell out the mandate of the central organ, the relations between the central organ and the companies in its portfolio and its relations with government as a whole. Because ultimately, the central organ is the shareholder representative. The shareholder is government itself. That will assist in giving renewed focus on the governance, the pursuit of the commercial and developmental mandates of these entities, so that they are able to address their commercial issues. We stabilize the boards and other governance structures, and we are sure, we are certain that the shareholder compacts have been developed, right, and they are current, that the corporate plans are there and they are current, and that the companies report on a regular basis. There is a proper performance monitoring and evaluation mechanism that can be utilized across the board, so that the companies fulfill their mandates.
Minister, what you've just outlined, no one can argue with. I mean, it sounds like a perfect wish list. But if it's compared to how some of these entities are run, you will obviously have to admit that we fall down on a number of them. Even in institutions that doesn't directly concern you. Let's say, for example, your SABC, perpetual crisis, one interim board to the next interim board. How do we prevent, Minister, these important institutions and the fact that we need to put capable people there? How do we prevent that process from being abused for narrow party political adventures that some in government have been getting up to? How do you prevent these institutions from becoming instruments of largesse where people dish out patronage, and ensure that the institutions are actually used for the mandates that they are required and fulfill the work that they're supposed to do, instead of becoming a way in which one can reward a pal for being a good friend or for putting a cozy deal together?
On the one hand, the existence of a legislation is going to assist in governing how these companies are governed. Because at the present moment, what happens is that you draw from the Companies Act, you draw from the PFMA, and from other pieces of legislation. Some of the companies have specific legislation that governs them, but those pieces of legislation don't address the governance issues
Right.
that are then governed by your Companies Act and others. But let me venture into a controversial
Oh, please do be
issue.
controversial.
The challenge at SAPC is one we need to address through legislative amendments. To have a board that is appointed through a process of political negotiation and compromises
And maneuvering.
and maneuvering makes it difficult for the minister as the shareholder representative to exercise shareholder responsibility, but at the same time makes the board itself to be a concoction of that political maneuvering.
But I suppose
So-
Parliament there is the big arbiter, isn't it? Because it happens through Parliament.
But the problem is that it hasn't helped. So you have a board that doesn't exactly know to whom is it accountable. Does it account to Parliament? Does it account to the political parties that nominated the individuals? Does it account to the minister? What if the minister gives them direction? Do they listen to it, or do they go back to the people who nominated them to seek different mandates?
Indeed.
So it becomes a problem. You need to address that, and I know it's going to be a power struggle between various agencies involved. But at the end of the day, all the agencies involved must put at the top of their minds the overriding interest of the nation, to ensure that the company functions properly, able to fulfill its public mandate as a public broadcaster, but also financially viable. And that is the challenge which they are going to face.